For 6 years, the boy rubbed his ear. Every specialist said the same thing. Congenital. Permanent. Nothing we can do. His father was one of the most feared men in southern Italy, a mafia boss who could make problems disappear with a phone call. But his son's silence? That, he couldn't fix. He spent fortunes, traveled from Milan to Zurich to clinics with no names on the doors. They all gave him the same answer. Irreversible. Then a maid fleeing her own demons noticed something buried deep inside that child's ear, and what she pulled out will leave you speechless. Before we begin, hit the like button, subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Now let's dive in. The Costa estate sat on a hillside overlooking the Tyrrhenian Sea. From the outside, it looked like something out of a dream. Stone walls 3 feet thick, iron gates that could stop a car, gardens manicured to perfection. Olive trees older than the country itself. Windows that reflected sunlight like gold. But inside, silence. Not the peaceful kind. Not the kind that feels like rest. This silence was thick, oppressive, like something had been buried alive and was still struggling to breathe. Servants moved through the marble hallways without speaking. Their footsteps were soft, careful, deliberate. They'd learned quickly. Don Adolfo liked things quiet. No music played in that house. No television noise. No laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Just silence. And somewhere in that silence, a father was suffocating. Adolfo Costa spent most evenings in his study, staring at the oil painting above the fireplace. There she was. Isabella. Her smile frozen in time, her dark eyes still bright, still alive. Next to her, a younger version of himself, back when he still believed he could protect the people he loved. And between them, Durante at 3 years old, before Adolfo understood that his son would never hear his mother's name spoken aloud. Isabella died the day Durante was born. Her body gave out after hours of labor, after complications the doctors said they couldn't have predicted. Adolfo held her hand while the light left her eyes, while her lips moved but no sound came out. Just like their son. Adolfo never forgave himself. He ran an empire built on control, on making sure nothing happened unless he allowed it. But he couldn't control this. Couldn't stop his wife from dying. Couldn't fix his son's ears. Couldn't undo the choice to use that particular hospital, that particular doctor, that particular night. The guilt sat on his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. So he did the only thing he knew how to do. He spent money. Millions of euros. The best specialists money could buy. Secret consultations. Experimental procedures. Doctors who worked in private clinics where patient records didn't exist and cash was the only currency that mattered. Every one of them said the same thing. Your son's deafness is congenital. The auditory nerve is damaged. There's nothing we can do. You need to accept this. Accept it. How could he accept that his boy would live in silence forever? That Durante would grow up never hearing his father's voice, never knowing what the sea sounded like when it crashed against the rocks below their villa, never understanding that the world wasn't supposed to be this quiet? So Adolfo kept searching, kept writing checks that would bankrupt small countries, kept hoping that somewhere out there, someone had the answer his money hadn't been able to buy yet. He didn't realize the answer wasn't coming from someone with a medical degree and years of training. It was coming from someone he'd never think to look at twice. Someone who was about to arrive at his gates with nothing but fear in her eyes and a reason to stay invisible. Her name was Lelia Minoldo, and she was about to change everything. Lelia Minoldo arrived on a cold November morning when the fog rolled in from the sea like a warning. She stood at the iron gates clutching a small canvas bag that held everything she owned, 2 changes of clothes, a photograph of her mother, and enough fear to fill the Mediterranean. She was running. From Durante. From the apartment in Naples where she'd learned that love could feel like fists and silence could mean survival. From the hospital bed 3 months ago where a nurse had whispered, "Next time he'll kill you." There wouldn't be a next time. Lelia had left in the middle of the night with nothing but the clothes on her back and a promise to herself. Disappear. Become no one. Survive. The Costa estate was perfect for that. Remote. Secretive. The kind of place where questions weren't asked and backgrounds weren't checked too carefully, as long as you kept your head down and your mouth shut. The head of staff, Signora Barisi, met her at the servants' entrance. Grey hair pulled back so tight it looked painful. Eyes that missed nothing and forgave less. "You're the new girl." "Yes, Signora." "You'll clean. You'll stay silent. You'll be invisible." Signora Barisi's voice was flat, mechanical. Don Adolfo doesn't tolerate disruptions. Especially around his son. "I understand. Do you?" The older woman stepped closer, her voice dropping. The last girl thought she understood too. She tried to comfort the boy when he cried. Thought she was being kind. She was gone by sunrise. Lelia's throat tightened. "I'm just here to work. The boy is not your concern. You don't speak to him. You don't touch him. You don't even look at him unless you're cleaning the room he's in. Don Adolfo is very clear about this." Signora Barisi paused. "And if you value your life, you'll remember that Don Adolfo's patience is even shorter than his temper." As they walked through the mansion, Lelia kept her eyes down, but she felt it immediately. The fear. It hung in the air like smoke. Servants moved like ghosts, communicating in glances and gestures. No one smiled. No one lingered. Everyone kept their distance from everyone else, as if proximity itself was dangerous. This was a house that ran on terror, not respect. And then she saw him. Durante sat alone in the sunroom, a small figure surrounded by wooden toys he'd arranged in perfect rows. He didn't look up when they passed. Didn't acknowledge anyone. His shoulders were hunched, his movements careful, controlled. But what made Lelia's breath catch was the way he touched his right ear. Just briefly. A wince crossing his small face. Then back to his toys as if nothing had happened. She knew that gesture. Had seen it before years ago, when her younger cousin Nico had an ear infection the family couldn't afford to treat properly. The way he touched his ear and flinched. The way the pain would come in waves. This wasn't deafness. This was something else. Days passed. Lelia cleaned floors, dusted furniture, changed linens in rooms that felt like tombs. She kept her head down like Signora Barisi demanded. But she couldn't stop watching Durante. Every morning, the same routine. The boy would sit in the sunroom, alone, building elaborate structures with blocks only to knock them down and start again. His world was small, contained, silent. No one spoke to him. The other servants avoided him entirely, as if his silence was contagious, as if getting too close might anger Don Adolfo or curse them somehow. But Lelia saw what they didn't. She saw loneliness. A child who pressed his small hand against windows, watching the world move without him. She saw the way his face would light up briefly when his father passed through the room, and how it would dim when Adolfo didn't stop, didn't notice, didn't see. And she saw how Durante kept touching his ear. Over and over. The right one only. Sometimes subtle, sometimes with a sharp intake of breath that no one else seemed to hear because no one was listening. One afternoon, Lelia was cleaning the sunroom while Durante played on the floor. He was building something with small wooden pieces, his concentration absolute. She moved quietly, carefully, trying to be invisible the way Signora Barisi demanded. Then Durante's hand slipped. A piece fell. He reached for it and winced, his hand flying to his right ear, his small face contorting in pain. Lelia froze. Their eyes met. For a long moment, neither moved. Durante's hand was still pressed to his ear, his eyes wide, uncertain, waiting to see if she'd notice, if she'd care, if she'd do what everyone else did and pretend she saw nothing. Lelia set down her cleaning cloth and slowly, carefully, knelt beside him. Not touching, not speaking, just present, just there. Durante's hand slowly lowered from his ear. He tilted his head, studying her with an intelligence that took her breath away. This wasn't a child lost in silence. This was a child desperately trying to be seen. She pointed gently to his ear, then to her own, then made a questioning gesture. Durante hesitated. Then slowly, carefully, he nodded. It hurt. Lelia's heart hammered. She glanced toward the door, making sure they were alone, then leaned slightly closer. Durante didn't pull away. He let her look, trusting her in a way that felt dangerous in this house where trust was currency no one could afford. And that's when she saw it. Deep inside his ear canal, barely visible in the afternoon light filtering through the windows, something dark, lodged where it shouldn't be. But before she could look closer, footsteps echoed in the hallway, and Durante's eyes went wide with fear. Lelia pulled back just as Signora Barisi appeared in the doorway, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk searching for prey. Lelia returned to her cleaning, heart pounding, while Durante went back to his toys as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. They both knew it. Over the following days, Lelia watched Durante more carefully. His routine never changed. Morning in the sunroom. Afternoon in the library where he'd look at picture books, tracing the images with small fingers. Evening in his room, alone, always alone. But the boy wasn't simple. He was brilliant. Durante built structures with blocks that would challenge children twice his age. He solved puzzles meant for adults. His drawings were detailed, purposeful, telling stories his voice couldn't. And his eyes missed nothing. He watched people, studied them, understood things about them they didn't understand about themselves. This wasn't a broken child. This was a child trapped. Lelia began leaving small drawings for him. Simple ones at first. A bird, a tree, a smile. Durante would find them and respond with his own drawings, more elaborate, more alive. They developed a language no one else in the house understood, a silent conversation that felt like rebellion in a place where everything was controlled. One morning, while Lelia was cleaning near where Durante played, a door slammed somewhere in the mansion. The vibration traveled through the floor. Durante's head snapped up immediately. His whole body tensed, aware, responsive. Lelia's breath caught. He'd reacted. Not to sound, but to the vibration. She tested it quietly over the next few days. Dropped a book on the floor near him. He didn't hear it, but when the vibration reached him, his eyes shifted. Knocked softly on the table he sat at. His hand stilled. Pressed her palm against the wall and hummed. Durante looked up, confused but aware that something was happening. He wasn't completely cut off from the world. He was responding to physical sensation, to pressure, to movement in the air around him. But only sometimes. Only from certain angles. Only she realized with growing certainty, from his left side. The right ear, the one he kept touching, the one with something dark lodged inside, that ear gave him nothing but pain. Lelia's mind raced. She'd heard stories growing up. Her cousin Nico, a classmate in school. Children who'd lost hearing because of infections, obstructions, things that could be fixed if someone looked carefully enough. But asking questions here could get her killed. She'd seen how Signora Barisi watched her. How the other servants kept their distance, as if association itself was dangerous. How Adolfo Costa moved through his own home like a storm that could break at any moment, his grief and rage barely contained beneath expensive suits and cold silence. And she'd felt his eyes on her lately, watching from doorways, observing the way Durante responded to her presence, the way the boy's shoulders relaxed slightly when she was near. Adolfo stood in the shadows of the library one afternoon, arms crossed, expression unreadable as Lelia and Durante communicated through gestures and drawings. She felt his stare like a physical weight, dangerous and assessing. Was she helping his son or crossing a line that would get her disappeared like the girl before her? That evening, as Lelia brought fresh linens to Durante's room, she found him sitting on his bed, both hands pressed to his right ear, his small face pale and twisted in agony. Before she could move, before she could reach him, Durante's eyes rolled back and his body went limp, collapsing onto the bed like a puppet whose strings had been cut. Lelia screamed for help. Servants came running. Signora Barisi. The guards. Within minutes, a private doctor arrived, one who lived on the estate, paid to be available at all hours, paid to ask no questions. Durante came to within seconds, groggy and confused, but Adolfo's rage filled the room like poison gas. What happened? His voice was deadly quiet, the kind of quiet that preceded violence. I don't know, Don Adolfo. I was bringing linens and found him. You were alone with my son. He collapsed before I could. Get out. The words were barely above a whisper, but they hit like a slap. Now. Lelia fled, her hands shaking, her mind racing. She'd seen something in that moment before Durante collapsed. The way he'd clutched his ear. The pallor of his skin. The pain that seemed to radiate from deep inside his skull. That night, unable to sleep, Lelia did something dangerous. She snuck into the library and found the medical books on the highest shelves, the ones covered in dust because no one looked at them anymore. She read by moonlight, her heart hammering every time the old house creaked. Ear anatomy. Hearing loss. Congenital conditions. And then, buried in a chapter about childhood deafness, obstructions, foreign bodies, impacted wax, infections that calcified, objects lodged so deep they created pressure, pain, and progressive hearing loss that mimicked congenital damage. Her hands froze on the page. What if Durante's deafness wasn't permanent? What if something was blocking his ear canal, something the doctors had missed or chosen not to see? The thought hit her like ice water. She remembered her cousin Nico, remembered how the local doctor had finally looked closely enough, how he'd removed a small pebble Nico had pushed into his ear at age 3. How Nico had heard again, suddenly, miraculously. She thought about the specialists Adolfo had taken Durante to. The private consultations. The massive payments. The years of treatment that never ended, never resolved, just continued indefinitely. What if those doctors knew? What if keeping a Mafia boss's son in treatment, keeping him dependent, keeping the money flowing? What if that was worth more than a cure? Lelia's stomach turned. She thought of the medical files she'd seen glimpses of during cleaning, the endless appointments, the experimental procedures that led nowhere. The stack of papers in Adolfo's study, consultation reports in languages she couldn't read, from clinics in countries she'd never heard of. Adolfo Costa could buy anything. Loyalty. Silence. Even lies dressed up as medical expertise. But he couldn't buy what he didn't know to look for. Flashbacks haunted Lelia as she lay in her small servants' quarters. She remembered Adolfo's face in the sunroom yesterday, watching Durante with such desperate love it hurt to witness. She remembered the oil painting of his dead wife, the grief that soaked into the walls of this mansion like rot. Adolfo wasn't evil. He was drowning. And the doctors he trusted, the specialists he'd paid millions to, they were holding his head underwater while pretending to save him. But what could she do? She was a maid. A runaway with no credentials, no authority, no voice. Speaking up would get her killed. Questioning Don Adolfo's doctors would be seen as insubordination, disrespect, a challenge to his judgment. She'd be gone by sunrise. Or worse. Yet every time she closed her eyes, she saw Durante's small face twisted in pain, his hand clutching his ear, his body going limp. Lelia spent the next 2 days in agonized silence, watching, waiting, caught between fear and responsibility. She saw Durante in the sunroom, pale and withdrawn, touching his ear more frequently now. She saw Adolfo watching his son from doorways, helpless and haunted. And then, on the third night, she heard it. A scream from Durante's room that cut through the mansion's silence like a knife. By the time she reached his door, Durante was on the floor, convulsing, both hands clutching his head, his silent world finally producing sound, the sound of agony too great to contain. The doctor came again. The same one who lived on the estate, who always said the same things, who gave Durante pills that did nothing and charged Adolfo a fortune for his discretion. Durante fought him. Actually fought. Thrashing and kicking when the doctor tried to examine his ear, terror written across his small face in a language everyone could read but no one acknowledged. "He's getting worse," the doctor said to Adolfo in the hallway afterward, his voice clinical and empty. "The condition is degenerative. We may need to consider more aggressive interventions. More interventions. More treatments. More money. More nothing." Lelia watched from the shadows, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. The next morning, Durante found her. Not the other way around. He sought her out in the servants' wing where he'd never ventured before, his small hand reaching for hers, his eyes pleading for something he couldn't name. Trust. Lelia's throat tightened. She glanced around, they were alone, and led him to a small storage room where sunlight filtered through a high window. She knelt so they were eye level. Durante pointed to his ear, then to her, then made a gesture like opening something. He wanted her to look. "I need you to stay very still," she whispered, knowing he couldn't hear but hoping he'd understand her expression. "Can you do that for me?" Durante nodded. Lelia's hands trembled as she gently tilted his head, letting the light fall into his ear canal. She looked closer, her breath catching. There. Deep inside, darker than it should be, something that didn't belong. Solid. Embedded. Years old, maybe. Pressed so deep into the canal that every movement, every pressure change, every breath must feel like knives. This wasn't deafness. This was torture. Durante's hand found hers and squeezed. When she looked at his face, he was crying silently, and then he did something that broke her completely. He touched his ear, then made a gesture toward the doctors who'd examined him, then shook his head violently. No doctors. He didn't trust them. Maybe couldn't even remember a time before the pain, before the procedures that never helped, before the strangers who poked and prodded and left him exactly as broken as they found him. But he trusted her. Lelia pulled him close, feeling his small body shake against hers. "I won't hurt you," she whispered into his hair. "I promise. I won't hurt you." The weight of that promise settled on her shoulders like stones. If she was right, she could help him. If she was wrong, or if she tried and failed, Adolfo would kill her. Not metaphorically. Actually kill her. She'd seen the edge in his eyes, the barely contained violence that lived just beneath his expensive suits and cultured speech. And even if she succeeded, who was she to make this choice? She wasn't a doctor. Wasn't trained. One wrong move and she could damage Durante permanently, could destroy what little hearing capacity might still exist, could hurt him worse than he was already hurting. But doing nothing, watching him suffer, watching those doctors bleed Adolfo dry while his son screamed in silent agony, that felt like a different kind of murder. 2 days later, Adolfo summoned his senior staff. "I'll be away for 3 days. Business in Rome." His eyes found Lelia in the back of the group. "The house will run exactly as it does when I'm here. Nothing changes. No one steps out of line." The message was clear. He was watching. Even from Rome, he would know. That evening, Lelia helped Durante prepare for bed, her mind at war with itself. She'd made her decision, hadn't she? She'd researched enough. Knew what to look for, what to avoid. Had sterilized tweezers and prepared clean cloths. But looking at Durante's trusting face, she felt the weight of every possible consequence. If she failed, this child would suffer. If she succeeded, she might not survive the aftermath. Durante climbed into bed, and Lelia turned to leave. Then she heard it. A sound she'd never heard from him before. A whimper. Raw and desperate and full of pain that had finally found voice. Durante's face contorted, both hands flying to his right ear as his small body began to seize with agony that could no longer be contained. Durante's body went rigid, his back arching off the bed as a scream tore from his throat. Silent no more, raw and primal and full of 6 years of trapped agony. Lelia didn't think. She moved. She scooped him into her arms, carried him to the chair by the window where the moonlight was strongest, and locked the bedroom door behind them. Her hands shook as she turned the old iron key, the click echoing like a gunshot in her mind. This was it. The moment she couldn't take back. Durante was sobbing now, tears streaming down his face, his small hands clutching his ear so hard his fingernails drew blood. The pain had broken through whatever wall he'd built around it, whatever tolerance a child could develop for suffering that never ended. "Please," Lelia whispered, though she didn't know who she was talking to. God, maybe. Her dead mother. Anyone who might be listening. "Please let me help him. Please don't let me make this worse." She'd prepared everything earlier, hidden in her apron pocket. Sterilized tweezers she'd boiled 3 times. Clean cloths. A small flashlight she'd stolen from the supply closet. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Durante looked at her through his tears, and something passed between them. Permission. Trust. Desperation meeting desperation. Lelia positioned him carefully in the moonlight, tilted his head, and looked one more time. The obstruction was there, darker now, more defined. She could see the edges of it, compressed and hardened, wedged so deep it must have been there for years. Maybe since birth. Maybe since someone missed it in those crucial early days when a simple examination could have changed everything. "I need you to be very, very still," she said, her voice steady even though her soul was screaming. "It's going to hurt, but only for a moment. Then it will be over. I promise." Durante's hand found hers and squeezed. He understood. Lelia said a prayer she'd learned as a child, steadied her breathing, and began. The tweezers slipped the first time, her hands too unsteady. Durante flinched, but didn't pull away. She tried again, going slower, gentler, using the moonlight and her stolen flashlight to guide her. The obstruction was compressed, hardened by years of pressure and bodily fluids, but she could feel it give slightly as she worked. Durante's breathing came in short, sharp gasps. His hand gripped hers so hard her bones ached. But he stayed still. Trusted her. Believed her when no one else in his life had earned that belief. And then, suddenly, she felt it release. The obstruction came free in one piece. Dark, solid, impossibly large for something that had lived inside a child's ear. Old wax compacted around something harder, something that looked like it might have been a small bead or stone, pushed in deep when Durante was too young to remember, too young to tell anyone. The moment it came out, everything changed. Durante gasped. Not in pain. In shock. His eyes went wide, his mouth falling open, his whole body going perfectly still. And then his head turned slowly, toward the window where the wind was moving through the trees outside. He could hear it. The rustling leaves. The distant sound of waves against rocks. The old house settling and creaking around them. Sound. Entering his world for the first time in 6 years. Durante's hand flew to his ear, the left one now the good one, as if trying to understand where this miracle was coming from. His breathing quickened. His eyes filled with tears again, but different tears. Wonder instead of pain. And then his lips moved, forming a word he'd only ever seen others speak, never understanding what it meant, what it sounded like, what it felt like to make sound with your own voice. Papa. It came out broken, unpracticed, the voice of someone learning to speak at 6 years old. But it was real. It was sound. It was his. Lelia pressed her hand over her mouth to keep from sobbing, from screaming with relief and terror and joy all tangled together. Durante turned to her, his eyes asking 1,000 questions he didn't have words for yet. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and pulled him close. And then they both heard it. Footsteps. Heavy. Purposeful. Moving down the hallway toward Durante's room faster than they should be, because Adolfo Costa wasn't supposed to be back from Rome for 2 more days. The doorknob rattled. Once. Twice. Then a fist pounded against the wood hard enough to shake the frame. Open this door. Adolfo's voice was ice and murder. Now. Lelia's blood turned to water. She looked at Durante, still clutching her hand, still processing the impossible reality of sound flooding his senses. There was blood on her fingers. Tweezers on the table. The obstruction sitting in a cloth like evidence of a crime. Which, in Adolfo Costa's eyes, it was. Open it, or I break it down. Lelia's hands shook as she unlocked the door. It flew open before she could step back, and Adolfo filled the doorway like a storm given human form. His eyes went immediately to his son, then to the blood on Lelia's hands, then to the tweezers. What did you do? The words were barely human. Don Adolfo, I can explain. What did you do to my son? 2 guards appeared behind him, their hands already reaching for Lelia. She didn't resist as they grabbed her arms, yanking her away from Durante. The boy's eyes went wide with fear, his mouth opening, trying to form words he didn't know how to make yet. She hurt him. Adolfo moved toward Durante, his hands shaking as he reached for his son. Call the doctor. Now. Get her out of my sight. And then Durante screamed. Not a cry of pain. A scream of sound, of voice, of a child who just discovered he could make the world hear him. The noise tore through the room like lightning, raw and unpracticed and absolutely, unmistakably real. Adolfo froze mid-step. His entire body went rigid. His eyes locked onto Durante's face with an expression Lelia had never seen before, disbelief so profound it looked like pain. Durante screamed again, his small face contorted with effort and emotion, and this time the scream became a word. Papa. It was broken, malformed, the voice of someone who'd never spoken before. But it was his son's voice. His son's sound. His son calling for him. Adolfo's knees buckled. He caught himself on the bedpost, his face draining of all color. Durante. His voice cracked. Can you? Durante's tears were flowing freely now. He reached toward his father with both hands, and sound kept coming, unpracticed and beautiful and impossible. Papa. 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 The word over and over, like Durante was testing it, tasting it, claiming it as his own. Each repetition hit Adolfo like a physical blow. The most feared man in southern Italy stood trembling, tears streaming down his face, unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what he was hearing. The guard's grip on Lelia had loosened, their own faces slack with shock. Even they understood they were witnessing something that shouldn't be possible. Durante kept saying it. Papa. Then other sounds, experimental and awkward, his mouth forming shapes around noises he was hearing for the first time. The wind. The creaking house. His own breathing. Adolfo took a step toward his son, then another, moving like a man in a dream. He reached Durante and dropped to his knees beside the chair, his hands hovering over the boy, afraid to touch him, afraid this miracle might shatter if he moved too quickly. You can hear me? Adolfo's voice was barely a whisper. Durante nodded, his small hand reaching out to touch his father's face. Then he did something that stopped time itself. He smiled. A real smile. And spoke again, clearer this time. Loud. Adolfo pulled his son against his chest and broke. Sobs racked his body, 6 years of grief and guilt and helplessness pouring out in a torrent he couldn't control. Durante clung to him, feeling the vibrations of his father's crying, hearing the sound of it, understanding for the first time what emotion sounded like. The guards released Lelia completely. She stood frozen, blood still on her hands, watching the most dangerous man she'd ever met weep like a child in his son's arms. Then Adolfo's eyes found hers over Durante's shoulder. The grief was still there, but something else had joined it. Something harder to read. Confusion. Anger. Gratitude. Suspicion. Explain, he said, his voice hoarse. Explain what you did. Before Lelia could answer, Signora Barisi appeared in the doorway, phone in hand, her face pale. Don Adolfo, the doctor is on his way. And in that moment, Lelia realized the miracle wasn't over. It was about to be questioned, tested, and possibly condemned by the same medical establishment that had failed Durante for 6 years. The doctor arrived within the hour, the same one who'd been treating Durante for years, whose face had always carried the same expression of professional sympathy and expensive helplessness. But when he examined Durante's ear, when he ran his tests, when he watched the boy respond to sounds with wonder and precision, his professional mask cracked. I don't understand. The obstruction you describe, it should have been visible on imaging. We've done scans, examinations. Should have been visible. Adolfo's voice was quiet. Deadly. Meaning it was visible. Meaning you saw it. The doctor's face went pale. Don Adolfo, I assure you, the diagnosis was complex. Congenital deafness often presents with. Get out. but the boy needs follow-up care proper. Get out. Adolfo took a step forward, and the doctor fled. By morning, Durante was at a real hospital. Not a private clinic that accepted cash and asked no questions. A real hospital with real doctors who had real reputations to protect. They confirmed it within hours. Complete hearing restoration in the right ear. Moderate hearing loss in the left from years of compensation and neglect. The obstruction had been there since infancy. A foreign body, likely introduced accidentally, that had become impacted and calcified over years. This should have been detected in any standard examination, the head of otolaryngology told Adolfo, her voice clinical but edged with disbelief. Any competent specialist would have seen it within the first year. Adolfo stood at the window of Durante's hospital room, watching his son sleep peacefully for the first time in recent memory. They told me it was congenital. Irreversible. They lied. The doctor's words hung in the air like a verdict. Or they were criminally incompetent. Either way, your son suffered unnecessarily for years. That night, Adolfo returned to his study and did what he did best. He investigated. The medical files he'd kept meticulously for 6 years told a story he'd been too desperate to see before. The early examinations with notes that were vague, conclusions that were definitive without supporting evidence. The specialists who'd recommended ongoing treatment rather than resolution. The consultations that cost fortunes and led nowhere. Then he found it. Buried in records from Durante's second year. A note from the first specialist, the one in Milan. Scrawled in the margin of a diagnostic report, possible foreign body obstruction, requires further examination. Further examination that never happened. Instead, that doctor had diagnosed congenital nerve damage and referred Durante to another specialist. Who'd referred him to another. Who'd referred him to another. A chain of expensive consultations, each one affirming the diagnosis before it, none of them looking closely enough to question what they'd been told. Or choosing not to look. Adolfo's hands shook as he pulled out payment records. Millions of euros. Spread across years. Consultations that never ended, treatments that never worked, hope that was sold and resold like a commodity. His empire had taught him one thing: follow the money. These doctors hadn't failed to see Durante's obstruction. They'd chosen not to see it. Because a cured patient was a lost revenue stream. But a Mafia boss's son with an incurable condition? That was a retirement fund. The rage that filled Adolfo was cold and precise. The same rage that had built his empire. But this time, it had a different target. Not rivals. Not enemies. The system he'd trusted. The professionals he'd believed. The men in white coats who'd looked him in the eye and lied while his son suffered. By dawn, Adolfo had made calls. The kind of calls that ended careers, that closed clinics, that made men disappear from their comfortable lives into very uncomfortable questions from authorities they'd thought they'd paid off. The medical network that had failed Durante would learn what it meant to cross Adolfo Costa. Not through violence, that would be too quick. Through exposure, through ruin, through the systematic dismantling of everything they'd built on lies. But first, there was someone else he needed to see. Adolfo stood from his desk, straightened his jacket, and walked through his mansion with purpose, his footsteps echoing through hallways that had been silent for too long. He was going to find the maid who'd saved his son's life while risking her own, and God help him, he didn't know whether he was going to thank her or destroy her for daring to do what no one else had. Lelia was packing when Adolfo found her. The small canvas bag that had held everything she owned now held even less. She'd left behind anything that might slow her down. She'd saved Durante, and that would have to be enough. Running was what she did best. Stop. Adolfo's voice filled the doorway of her tiny room. Lelia's hands froze on the zipper. This was it. She'd known it would come. You didn't touch a Mafia boss's son without permission. You didn't make choices that weren't yours to make. Miracle or not, she'd crossed a line that people didn't come back from. Turn around. She did, slowly, expecting to see rage. Instead, she saw something she'd never imagined seeing on Adolfo Costa's face. Uncertainty. My son can hear because of you. The words came out rough, unpracticed. The doctors I paid millions to, they lied. 4 years. And a maid saw what they refused to see. Lelia said nothing. There was nothing to say. Adolfo took a step into the room. Then another. And then, in front of the other servants who'd gathered in the hallway, in front of his guards, in front of everyone who'd ever feared his name, he knelt. The most dangerous man in southern Italy knelt before a maid. Forgive me, he said, his voice breaking. You risked everything. And I almost killed you for it. Lelia's throat closed. She couldn't speak. Couldn't breathe. My son trusts you. He trusts you more than he's ever trusted anyone, including me. You gave him something I couldn't buy with all my money, all my power, all my connections. Adolfo looked up at her, tears in his eyes. You gave him the world. Behind him, Durante appeared, holding Signora Barisi's hand. His eyes found Lelia immediately, and his face broke into a smile that could have melted stone. Lelia. His voice was getting stronger, clearer. He pulled free and ran to her, wrapping his small arms around her waist. The sound of her name in his voice destroyed her. Lelia dropped to her knees and held him, sobbing into his hair, feeling his laughter vibrate against her chest, laughter he could finally hear himself make. Adolfo stood slowly. You'll stay. Not as a maid. As family. You'll be protected, provided for, respected. You'll have whatever you need, whatever you want. But more than that, his voice softened. You'll have a home. A real one. If you want it. Lelia looked around the room, at the servants who no longer looked at her with suspicion but with something like awe, at Adolfo who'd just given her something more valuable than money, choice. I'll stay, she whispered. For him. For us, Adolfo corrected. He looked at his son, and something in his face shifted. No more silence. That evening, for the first time in 6 years, music played in the Costa mansion. Adolfo had brought in musicians, a small string quartet who'd been told to play whatever they wished. They set up in the main hall, unsure, afraid, waiting for the order to stop that everyone knew would come. It never did. Durante stood in the center of the hall, his eyes wide, his whole body trembling as violin and cello and viola wove together into something beautiful. He'd never heard music before. Never understood what it could do, how it could make you feel things you didn't have words for. Adolfo knelt beside his son. Do you like it? Durante nodded, tears streaming down his face. Then he did something that made everyone in the room stop breathing. He laughed. Out loud. A real, full laugh of pure joy. The sound echoed off marble floors and vaulted ceilings, bouncing through a house that had forgotten what happiness sounded like. Other servants began to smile, then to whisper to each other, then to laugh quietly themselves. The silence that had ruled this mansion for 6 years cracked, then shattered, then disappeared. Adolfo pulled his son close, pressing his face against Durante's hair, and whispered words he'd waited 6 years to say. I love you. Can you hear me? I love you. Durante pulled back, looked his father in the eyes, and said the words back. Imperfect, unpracticed, but real. Love you, Papa. Lelia watched from the doorway, Signora Barisi standing beside her with tears running down her weathered face. The old woman reached out and squeezed Lelia's hand. You brought life back to this house, she whispered. Durante turned then, hearing the whisper from across the room, his face lighting up with wonder at how sound traveled, how voices carried, how the world was so much bigger and louder and more alive than he'd ever known. Adolfo stood and raised his hand. The musicians stopped playing, uncertainty crossing their faces. Again, Adolfo said, his voice carrying through the hall. Louder this time. Let him hear everything. And as the music swelled, as Durante spun in circles with his arms out, laughing at the sound of his own footsteps on marble, as servants began to move freely and speak openly and exist without fear, Lelia understood something profound. Silence had never been about Durante's deafness. It had been about a father's grief, a household's fear, a system built on control that had forgotten what it was protecting. But now, in this moment, watching a child discover sound and a father discover his son and a house remember how to live, silence had finally lost its power. Durante ran to the window, pressed his hands against the glass, and gasped as he heard the wind, the trees, the distant crash of waves against rocks. It's so loud, he said, wonder filling every syllable. The whole world is so loud. Adolfo stood beside him, placed a hand on his son's shoulder, and for the first time in 6 years, didn't ask the world to be quiet. He let it speak. Sometimes the answer isn't in the expensive clinic. Sometimes it's in the hands of someone brave enough to look closer. Lelia risked everything. Durante got his voice back. And a father finally heard his son say, I love you. The Costa Mansion isn't silent anymore. Hit subscribe if this story moved you. Share it if you think someone needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose between safety and doing what's right? Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is care when everyone else has given up.